At 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, the ground beneath San Francisco did something no American city had ever experienced at that scale before. It twisted, not shook, twisted, like a giant hand wringing a wet cloth. Streets snapped, steel rails bent into snakes, brick buildings folded as if made of paper. In less than a minute, one of the richest, proudest cities in the United States was broken open from below. But the earthquake was only the beginning. What followed would turn a natural disaster into one of the greatest urban catastrophes and acts of courage in American history. San Francisco, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city drunk on its own success. Gold had built it, railroads had fed it, and ambition had hardened it into stone. The hills were crowned with mansions, the waterfront packed with ships from every corner of the world, and the streets alive with bankers, dock workers, immigrants, artists, gamblers, and dreamers. Newspapers boasted that San Francisco was the Paris of the West, immune to the limitations of geography or fate. Engineers knew better. For decades, scientists had warned that the city sat on unstable ground, crisscrossed by fault lines like invisible scars beneath the earth. The most dangerous of them, the San Andreas Fault, ran hundreds of miles through California, storing pressure year after year. But warnings were inconvenient, and inconvenient truths rarely survive prosperity. Newspapers avoided the word earthquake for fear of hurting real estate prices. City officials dismissed concerns as academic pessimism. Buildings rose higher, heavier, and more rigid, built of unreinforced brick and stone that looked permanent but was fatally brittle. On the night of April 17, 1906, San Francisco went to sleep confident. The city had hosted opera performances, late-night card games, and crowded saloons. The weather was calm. The bay was quiet. There was no warning. At 5:12 a.m., the warning came anyway. The first jolt was violent enough to throw people from their beds. The second was worse. The earth rolled in waves, lifting sidewalks and dropping them again. Chimneys collapsed like chalk. Entire brick facades peeled away and crashed into the streets below. The sound was not one sound, but many at once: grinding stone, snapping timber, shattering glass, screaming steam pipes, and human voices crying out in confusion and terror. Inside City Hall, one of the largest municipal buildings in the world, the Grand Dome cracked open, marble columns shattered. In hotels, guests were crushed by falling ceilings. In working-class neighborhoods, wooden houses fared better, swaying but often remaining standing, an irony that saved thousands of poorer residents while wealthier districts crumbled. Then came the fires. Gas mains, ruptured by the quake, leaked into streets and basements. Sparks ignited them almost instantly. Flames burst from the ground itself, racing through neighborhoods already broken and helpless. The city's water mains had snapped, leaving firefighters with hoses but no water. Fire engines arrived at blazes only to stand useless as buildings burned in front of them. Within hours, San Francisco was not one disaster, but dozens. Mayor Eugene Schmitz, awakened by the quake, staggered through the wreckage in disbelief. With the police chief and military officers, he made a decision that would haunt the city forever. Federal troops from nearby Presidio would be deployed, and they were authorized to shoot looters on sight. Martial law was declared in practice, though not legally. Soldiers, many barely trained for civilian crisis, now roamed the streets with rifles amid chaos, smoke, and fear. The fires spread unchecked. Whole blocks ignited at once. Winds carried embers across fire breaks. Attempts to dynamite buildings to stop the flames often backfired, creating more ignition points. The very tools meant to save the city helped destroy it. For 3 days and nights, San Francisco burned. From the hills, survivors watched the city glow red at night like a furnace. The financial district vanished. Chinatown, already targeted by racist politicians who saw the disaster as an opportunity, was nearly erased. Cable car lines melted. Churches collapsed. Newspapers printed their last editions in the streets before their offices burned. And yet, amid the destruction, something extraordinary happened. Ordinary people became heroes. Doctors performed surgeries in parks using whiskey as anesthesia. Shopkeepers fed thousands for free until their supplies ran out. Immigrant communities organized rescue efforts while facing open discrimination from authorities. Black residents, often excluded from relief aid, formed their own support networks. Women, barred from political power, coordinated refugee camps and medical stations with ruthless efficiency. One such camp rose in Golden Gate Park, where thousands of refugees gathered. They slept under blankets, tents, and improvised shelters, unsure if they had homes to return to or a city at all.
For many Americans, it was a revelation. Nature could humble even the greatest cities. Decades later, survivors would describe the quake not just as terror, but as transformation. Old social barriers briefly fell. Kindness and cruelty existed side by side. The city that emerged was different, harder, more cautious, but still defiant. San Francisco would rise again, rebuilt on the same fault lines, still daring the earth beneath it to try once more. Because if the 1906 earthquake proved anything, it was this: America's cities could be broken, but they would not surrender. The fires did not end all at once. They retreated slowly, like a wounded beast unwilling to release its kill. On the fourth day, April 21, 1906, the wind finally shifted, and exhausted firefighters, joined by civilians who had not slept for days, managed to choke off the last major blazes. When the smoke thinned, San Francisco stood exposed, stripped of illusion. What remained was silence. A silence broken only by the crackle of cooling embers, the distant cries of people searching for family, and the sound of hammers already at work. Even before official announcements, the rebuilding had begun, not out of optimism, but necessity. More than 250,000 people were homeless. They could not wait. Across the ruins, handwritten signs appeared on half-standing walls. Restaurant open, bank operating here, dentist available. Businesses ran from tents, wagons, and sidewalks. Money changed hands amid ash and rubble. America's most capitalistic city refused to pause, even in mourning. But beneath this resilience ran a darker current. The refugee camps, scattered across parks and open land, quickly became mirrors of American inequality. White refugees received tents faster. Immigrant families, especially Chinese residents, were frequently denied supplies or forced into the most overcrowded areas. Some officials openly discussed preventing Chinese residents from returning to Chinatown altogether, seeing the disaster as a chance to erase a community they had long resented. Chinese leaders fought back, not with violence, but law and diplomacy. They appealed to the Chinese government, which threatened international consequences if San Francisco violated treaties protecting Chinese nationals. Under pressure, city officials backed down. Chinatown would be rebuilt, though never fully free from discrimination. Meanwhile, the soldiers patrolling the streets became both protectors and predators. Though ordered to stop looting, many lacked training in civilian law enforcement. Innocent people were shot, others were beaten or detained without cause. Fear of disorder had become as destructive as the disorder itself. The press, desperate to restore confidence, downplayed chaos. Newspapers claimed the city was nearly recovered within weeks. They exaggerated heroism and minimized suffering. This wasn't just propaganda, it was economic survival. San Francisco needed investors, insurers, and the nation's belief. Insurance companies were already fleeing. More than half the insurers covering San Francisco either went bankrupt or refused to pay full claims. Some policyholders received pennies on the dollar, others nothing at all. Lawsuits dragged on for years, reshaping American insurance law and forcing the industry to confront the reality of catastrophic risk. For working families, there were no lawsuits, only loss. Many never returned. They drifted east, south, anywhere work could be found. San Francisco's population dipped sharply, altering neighborhoods permanently. Some ethnic enclaves vanished, others grew stronger, rebuilt by shared trauma. One of the most overlooked legacies of the disaster lay beneath the city. Geologists, finally taken seriously, began mapping fault lines with urgency. The 1906 rupture stretched nearly 300 miles, one of the largest recorded on Earth.
It proved that earthquakes were not local curiosities, but regional forces capable of reshaping states. Universities expanded earth science programs. Federal agencies slowly acknowledged the need for disaster research. Still, America remained confident, perhaps too confident. Rebuilding accelerated through 1907 and 1908. Steel frame construction replaced brick. Skyscrapers rose with pride. Yet many cost-saving shortcuts remained. Earthquake-resistant design was discussed, but rarely enforced with rigor. The city wanted height, speed, and spectacle. By 1915, San Francisco hosted the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a world's fair meant to announce its rebirth. Millions attended. The palaces glittered. The city smiled for the cameras. But survivors never forgot the sound the earth had made that morning. They remembered how the ground had rolled like water, how fire leapt faster than feet could run, how neighbors became saviors and sometimes enemies. Children who had slept in refugee camps grew into adults who flinched to tremors and watched buildings with quiet suspicion. Nationally, the earthquake changed how Americans understood disaster response. The absence of coordination in 1906 became a lesson written in ash. Over the following decades, emergency management slowly professionalized. Communication systems improved. Building codes evolved. The seeds of what would eventually become FEMA were planted not by legislation, but by memory. The San Francisco earthquake also changed storytelling. For the first time, photographs of devastation reached Americans nationwide within days. Images of collapsed streets and refugee camps shocked the public. Disasters were no longer distant rumors, they were visual truths. The modern age of disaster journalism had begun. And yet, perhaps the most profound change was invisible. Before 1906, San Francisco believed itself untouchable, a city of destiny. Afterward, it understood vulnerability, not weakness, but exposure, the knowledge that greatness did not grant immunity. The earth beneath San Francisco still moves. Small quakes rattle dishes, fault lines still tighten, storing energy. Scientists say another great quake is inevitable. The city knows this now. It lives with the knowledge like a quiet companion. But it also remembers something else, that when the ground tore open and fire consumed stone, people stood up. They shared food. They carried strangers from the rubble. They rebuilt not because they were fearless, but because surrender was unthinkable. On April 18th each year at 5:12 a.m., a bell is sometimes rung in remembrance, not to mourn the city that was lost, but to honor the one that refused to disappear. Because in the story of America, San Francisco's greatest legacy is not its skyline.
It is the proof that even when the ground itself betrays you, a city, like a nation, can still choose to stand. In the decades that followed, the earthquake became more than a memory. It became a warning written into the bones of California. Children learned about it in school. Engineers cited it in lectures. Old men who had lived through it would fall silent when the topic arose, their eyes drifting somewhere far beyond the room, back to firelit nights and trembling ground. Yet memory fades faster than stone cracks. By the 1920s, a new generation had come of age in San Francisco, one that knew prosperity but not collapse. Jazz filled the clubs, automobiles replaced horses, buildings climbed higher than ever before. The city once again began to believe in permanence. But the earth never forgets. Seismologists studying the 1906 rupture realized something unsettling. Earthquakes were not random explosions of chaos. They were part of cycles, long, patient cycles measured in decades and centuries. Stress accumulated invisibly, like tension in a drawn bow.
When release came, it would come suddenly and without mercy. This knowledge spread slowly, often ignored by politicians and developers. Reinforced concrete and steel frame construction improved safety, but older buildings remained. Thousands lived and worked in structures that would not survive another major quake. Retrofitting cost money. Delay cost nothing, until it cost everything. The shadow of 1906 stretched far beyond San Francisco. In 1933, when an earthquake struck Long Beach and collapsed dozens of schools, killing over 100 people, lawmakers remembered San Francisco. California passed the Field Act, mandating earthquake-resistant design for public buildings. It was one of the first laws of its kind in the world. Disaster once again had forced progress. World War II transformed San Francisco into a military hub. Shipyards roared day and night. Troops passed through the city by the hundreds of thousands. Temporary buildings rose quickly, some dangerously so. Yet the war left little room for caution. Speed mattered more than safety. After the war, prosperity returned with force. Suburbs expanded, freeways carved through neighborhoods. The city modernized, but not evenly. Poor and minority communities often lived in the most vulnerable housing. The same inequalities exposed in 1906 remained, quietly waiting. Then, on October 17, 1989, at 5:04 p.m., the ground spoke again. The Loma Prieta earthquake was smaller than 1906, but it struck at rush hour during a World Series game watched by millions. Freeways collapsed, the Marina District burned, 43 people died. Images of fallen bridges flashed across television screens worldwide. For those who knew history, it felt like an echo. This time, the response was faster. Emergency coordination was stronger. Building codes saved lives. But the message was unmistakable. The threat had never left. Survivors of 1906, now long gone, were suddenly remembered not as relics, but as witnesses. Today, San Francisco stands as one of the most studied cities on Earth. Sensors monitor the ground constantly. Engineers simulate collapses before buildings are ever constructed. Retrofitting projects continue, block by block, quietly strengthening what once failed. Still, experts say it plainly, another major earthquake will come. As the 21st century advanced, the lesson of 1906 took on a new urgency, not because the past was calling louder, but because the future was arriving faster. San Francisco was no longer just a port city or a cultural capital. It had become a nerve center of global technology. Data flowed through it faster than ships ever had. Fortunes were built in years, not lifetimes. Glass towers rose where brick ruins once smoked. The city that once feared fire now trusted fiber optics and cloud servers, believing information itself had become weightless. But the ground beneath the servers was the same ground that had split open in 1906. Urban planners spoke in careful language about resilience and redundancy. Backup systems, distributed networks, emergency protocols. The vocabulary was modern, but the concern was ancient. What happens when everything stops at once? Hospitals drilled for mass casualties. Schools practiced drop, cover, and hold. Bridges were retrofitted with shock absorbers that could slide and flex instead of snap. Entire neighborhoods were reinforced quietly, without ceremony, without headlines. The work was expensive, slow, and politically unglamorous. And yet it was happening because 1906 had taught the city what neglect looked like. Still, danger does not disappear simply because it is acknowledged. Seismologists studying the 1906 rupture realized something unsettling. Earthquakes were not random explosions of chaos. They were part of cycles, long, patient cycles measured in decades and centuries. Stress accumulated invisibly, like tension in a drawn bow. When release came, it would come suddenly and without mercy. This knowledge spread slowly, often ignored by politicians and developers. Reinforced concrete and steel frame construction improved safety, but older buildings remained. Thousands lived and worked in structures that would not survive another major quake. Retrofitting cost money. Delay cost nothing, until it cost everything. The shadow of 1906 stretched far beyond San Francisco. In 1933, when an earthquake struck Long Beach and collapsed dozens of schools, killing over 100 people, lawmakers remembered San Francisco. California passed the Field Act, mandating earthquake-resistant design for public buildings. It was one of the first laws of its kind in the world. Disaster, once again, had forced progress. Survivors of 1906, now long gone, were suddenly remembered not as relics, but as witnesses. Today, San Francisco stands as one of the most studied cities on Earth. Sensors monitor the ground constantly. Engineers simulate collapses before buildings are ever constructed. Retrofitting projects continue, block by block, quietly strengthening what once failed. Still, experts say it plainly, another major earthquake will come.
This understanding reshaped how America approached crisis communication. Clear messaging, honest uncertainty, public trust. These became tools as essential as fire hoses and ambulances. And yet, for all the planning, one element remained unchanged. When the ground moves, everything becomes personal. No model can predict who will be trapped under rubble. No algorithm can decide whose home will burn. No policy can fully prepare a parent searching for a child in smoke-filled streets. The most advanced cities in the world are still collections of human beings, vulnerable, emotional, courageous, flawed. That was true in 1906. It remains true now. Each April 18, small ceremonies take place across San Francisco. Some are official, many are private. A moment of silence, a candle, a glance at an old photograph of streets turned to dust. These acts are not about fear of the next quake. They're about respect for the last one. Because remembrance is a form of preparedness. To remember 1906 is to remember what failed and what did not. Government stumbled, infrastructure collapsed, prejudice sharpened suffering, but compassion endured. Ingenuity emerged, community survived. The city did not rebuild because it was ordered to. It rebuilt because people needed each other. That is the part of the story that statistics cannot capture. Not the miles of fault rupture, not the billions in damage, not the columns of data and diagrams, but the image of neighbors pulling strangers from debris, of meals cooked over open fires for anyone who arrived, of a city refusing to abandon itself. That spirit became San Francisco's quiet inheritance, passed from generation to generation, even when its origin was forgotten. And perhaps that is why the story still matters to America. Because the San Francisco earthquake was never just about one city. It was about what happens when confidence collapses and choice remains. When nature reminds a nation that control is temporary, but character is not. In 1906, the earth spoke with violence. America listened, slowly, imperfectly, but permanently. And in that listening, it learned that the strength of a city is not measured by how high it builds, but by how it responds when everything it has built is suddenly at risk. The ground will move again. That much is certain. What matters, now as then, is what stands afterward. By the time the story of 1906 entered its second century, it had transformed from memory into myth. And that carried its own danger. Myths simplify. They polish suffering into inspiration and sand down uncomfortable truths. The San Francisco earthquake, retold too often as a tale of heroic rebirth, risked losing its sharpest lessons. Not everything about the response had been noble. Not every wound had healed. Some scars were simply buried beneath concrete and time. Historians digging deeper began uncovering voices long ignored. They found letters from Chinese families who had survived the quake only to be denied relief. Diaries from black dock workers who were forced into unpaid labor clearing debris under armed guard. Testimonies from women who ran entire relief camps while being excluded from official decision-making. The earthquake had flattened buildings, but it had not flattened power. Understanding this changed how the story was told. The disaster was no longer framed as a moment when everyone became equal in suffering. It was understood as a moment when inequality became impossible to ignore. Who received help first? Who was believed? Who was protected by law? And who was not? This recognition reshaped modern disaster ethics. In training manuals for emergency responders, San Francisco became a cautionary example. Aid must be equitable. Enforcement must be restrained. Order must never come at the cost of humanity. These principles were written not as ideals, but as corrections, born from failure. Even architecture carried the imprint of these realizations. Post-1906 rebuilding had favored downtown business interests, often pushing working-class residents farther from the city center. This pattern repeated itself across America after disasters for decades, until planners began to name it for what it was: disaster-driven displacement. The term disaster justice emerged from such reckonings, and at its root was a simple, painful understanding learned in San Francisco. Recovery is never neutral. Someone always pays the hidden cost. As climate change accelerated in the late 19th century and early 21st century, this understanding grew more urgent. Earthquakes were no longer the only unstoppable force cities faced. Wildfires, floods, heat waves, and rising seas joined the list. The lesson of 1906 expanded beyond geology. It became a blueprint for survival in an unstable world. Cities across the United States began asking new questions, questions San Francisco had been forced to confront early. How do you rebuild without repeating harm? How do you prepare without excluding the vulnerable? How do you tell the truth without causing panic? The answers were never simple, but they were no longer optional. San Francisco itself became a laboratory of resilience. Seawalls were redesigned. Emergency housing plans were rewritten. Community-based response networks formed. Neighbors trained to help neighbors when official help could not arrive fast enough. The city acknowledged at last that survival could not be centralized. That, too, was a lesson from 1906. When the earthquake struck, no single authority had controlled the chaos. Survival had depended on countless small decisions made by ordinary people. Modern planners now sought to harness that reality instead of fighting it. Resilience, they learned, is collective. And so the story of April 18, 1906 continued, not as a closed chapter, but as a living document. It informed how Americans talked about risk, responsibility, and readiness. It reminded them that disasters reveal who we are long before they reveal what we've built. In classrooms, students studied photographs of Market Street reduced to rubble. In laboratories, scientists traced the fault line's slow creep. In city halls, officials debated budgets that weighed present comfort against future safety. All of them, knowingly or not, were answering the same question the survivors of 1906 had faced.
What is worth protecting when everything else can be lost? For some, the answer was property. For others, prosperity. But history, written in ash and steel, suggested a different truth. What endured after San Francisco burned was not its buildings. Those could be replaced. What endured was its capacity to adapt, its willingness, however imperfect, to learn from ruin. That capacity would be tested again and again in cities across America in forms the people of 1906 could never have imagined. Yet the pattern remained familiar: shock, loss, reckoning, choice. The earthquake did not define San Francisco because it destroyed the city. It defined it because the city remembered. And in remembering, it taught a nation that survival is not an accident of geography or wealth, but the outcome of choices made before, during, and long after the ground begins to shake. The question lingered not as philosophy, but as pressure, subtle, constant, unavoidable. San Francisco learned to live with that pressure the way it lived with fog, sometimes ignored, sometimes feared, always present. Life moved forward. Children were born who would never hear first-hand accounts of the firestorms. Neighborhoods changed names, faces, and languages. Tech campuses replaced warehouses. Cafes replaced factories. The city reinvented itself again and again, as it always had. Yet beneath reinvention lay remembrance. In archives and museums, the artifacts of 1906 waited quietly. Melted safes, twisted rails, photographs where entire city blocks ended in nothingness. These objects did not shout, they did not dramatize, they simply existed, proof that modernity had once failed spectacularly. And that failure had consequences. One of the lasting consequences was psychological. Survivors passed down habits without explanation, sleeping near exits, keeping valuables close, distrusting brick buildings. These behaviors, unremarked and unrecorded, became part of the city's subconscious. Fear did not vanish, it evolved into instinct. Sociologists later noted this phenomenon across disaster-prone regions. Memory did not disappear with witnesses, it diffused, it settled into culture, shaping decisions long after the original event had faded from direct experience. In this way, the earthquake became part of San Francisco's identity, not as trauma, but as awareness. The United States, watching from afar, absorbed that awareness unevenly. Some cities listened, others dismissed it as California's problem. After all, earthquakes did not respect state borders, but belief often did. Risk was easier to ignore when it seemed geographically distant. Then disasters began arriving everywhere. The Mississippi flooded towns that had existed for centuries. Hurricanes erased coastlines. Wildfires turned suburbs to ash in hours. Each time, the same questions returned. Why weren't we ready? Why were warnings ignored? Why did recovery favor some and abandon others? And each time, historians quietly pointed back to San Francisco. Not because it was unique, but because it was early. The 1906 earthquake was one of the first moments when America confronted modern catastrophe without the shield of distance or denial. It happened in a major city, in broad daylight, with cameras watching. There was no frontier myth to soften it, no wilderness to blame. Civilization itself had failed. That was the shock America never forgot, even when it pretended to. By the early 2000s, disaster preparedness had become a field of study, a profession, a bureaucracy. Manuals were written, protocols standardized. Yet veterans of emergency response often spoke a quiet truth. No plan survives first contact with reality. What saves lives, they said, is not perfection, but flexibility. That lesson, too, came from 1906. Firefighters without water improvised, doctors without hospitals adapted, citizens without instructions acted. The disaster revealed that resilience is not rigid, it bends, it breaks rules, it prioritizes survival over procedure. Modern systems now attempt to build that adaptability into their design. Decentralized response, local leadership, community trust. These ideas sound innovative, but they are in truth ancient, rediscovered under pressure. Pressure like that which built along the San Andreas Fault. Scientists still monitor the fault relentlessly. They issue probabilities, not predictions. 30% in 30 years, 60% in 50. Numbers that feel abstract until the ground reminds people what they mean. And when that reminder comes, as it inevitably will, the story of 1906 will no longer be history, it will be context. The people who face the next great earthquake will not be the same people who faced the last. Their technologies will be different, their cities taller, their lives more interconnected, but their choices will echo those made over a century earlier. Will information be shared or withheld? Will aid be equal or selective? Will fear be used to control or courage to connect? Those questions cannot be answered by science alone. They are answered by values. That is why the San Francisco earthquake remains one of the most important events in American history, not because of how much it destroyed, but because of what it revealed when destruction stripped everything else away. It revealed the fragility of progress, the cost of denial, the power of solidarity, the danger of forgetting. In the end, the earthquake did not ask whether San Francisco deserved to survive. It offered no judgment. Nature never does. It simply presented a moment of truth. And in that moment, amid fire and ruin, the city chose to rebuild, not blindly, not perfectly, but consciously. That choice is what carried the story forward. It is what turned disaster into lesson, trauma into knowledge, loss into warning. And as long as cities continue to rise on uncertain ground, as long as human ambition meets natural force, the echo of April 18, 1906 will remain not as a threat, but as a reminder that survival is not guaranteed, that resilience is learned, and that when the earth moves, history watches, not to see what falls, but to see what stands back up.